It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster.
Southport must be a line in the sand. So nothing will be off the table in this inquiry. Nothing.
After the horrific murders of 3 young girls in Southport last summer, the Prime Minister says we face a new threat. Keir Starma has also rejected claims of a cover-up. We'll have the latest.
The golden age of America begins right now.
A new era begins in America. Is the optimism justified?
Under this Labour government, if you can work, you must work.
Yeah. Tough talk, but can ministers really get people off welfare and into work? Joining me today, Labour MP Chris Curtis, Conservative MP Harriet Cross, Politics Joe's Ava Santina Evans and Reform UK's former Director of Communications, Gawain Towler. This is Politics Live. You saw the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, there in the headlines, part of the speech he has given this morning, a statement on the July Southport attacks last year and the public inquiry that the government has announced it will hold into it. It comes after 18-year-old Axel Rudakabana yesterday pleaded guilty to the murders of 9-year-old Alice Da Silva Aguiar, Elsie Dot Stankham, who was 7, and 6-year-old BB King. My opening question to the panel, starting with you, Chris, is just how big a moment is this?
I think it's a really significant moment for this country. And I thought watching Keir Starmer's speech earlier really set that out. It's important that we note just how horrific this was. It's important that we note all of the very many failings that led to this incident happening. And it's important that we work as hard as we can as a government to ensure that something like this never happens again. I think the Prime Minister set out earlier the steps that he's putting in place to ensure that we are doing everything that we can to ensure that something like this never happens again. And in memory of those 3 girls who aren't with us anymore, it's so important that we continue to work towards that.
I mean, the Prime Minister certainly didn't lose any time in making that speech this morning, making that statement. How big a moment do you think it is in terms of what he said and the nature of his address?
It was a very, very important address to make, and as you said, it was welcome, but it was so soon after yesterday's events. Also welcome the Home Secretary saying that there will be an inquiry, which is certainly needed, and I'm sure we'll get into that a bit later on. At the centre of this, as always, are the victims, Alice, Elsie and BB, their families, others who are injured on the day, who this will stay with them forever. So albeit a line in the sand where we need to move forward from them, moving forward is a very different context to the rest of us. So we need to make sure that we are learning from events like this. We always say they should never happen again. They do happen again. So we need to make sure that our reaction when they do happen is correct as well, because that's all part of this.
Was it a watershed moment listening to the Prime Minister talking about this?
I mean, I worry that there's a lack of haste, really, because, I mean, it's right to have an inquiry, but that inquiry is going to take 3 years. But there are teachers out there this morning who are going to be still instructed to identify whether someone is being radicalised or might be dangerous online. And what they're essentially being told is the framework isn't in place to actually protect the pupils around them or the children around these, these violent people. What's changed for them this morning? Nothing.
Gawain?
I don't think it's a line in the sand. We've had so many. I don't know how many times we've had single killers, terrorists being described as such. I don't think it's a line in the sand. I also think it's extremely convenient that we're going to have an inquiry, and that's fine, good. But this is an inquiry where they can definitely blame the previous watch. All these prevent things took place under the Tories.
Well, do you think that's what this is, a blame game?
I think there is a certain amount of that, yes. I think it is easy for this government to have an inquiry into something like this where the blame is going to be laid on the Tory government of the last 14 years, their failures in Prevent. Prevent's been failure since it was set up. This is true. But I do think it's a convenient one. Other inquiries are not being held.
Can both things be true? It could be the failures of previous governments and this one. Chris, did you want to respond? Is that what this is about?
I do not think it's about that in the slightest. And look, you know, Harriet and I will sit here, I'm sure, many times in the future and have arguments about things that governments have got right and things that governments have got wrong. But this is not a day for that. This is a day for learning the lessons of things that have gone wrong right across the country under whoever's been in charge and ensuring we fix them to, even if not eradicate, minimise the chance of an event like this ever happening again. And that's what this inquiry will ensure happens.
Well, let's talk to the BBC Deputy Political Editor, Vicki Young. It was a hard-hitting and wide-ranging speech by the Prime Minister, not just a response to the guilty plea from yesterday and the July Southport murders. You were in the room. What did you make of it?
It did feel like a significant moment, and that is because, sadly, of course, there are lots of horrific crimes that do happen in this country, but it isn't very often that a Prime Minister calls a press conference, he launches a public inquiry. The Home Secretary was there, the Justice Secretary was there, which I think, you know, showed that this was much broader. Now, I think part of this was the Prime Minister wanting to front up about the state failures and the terrible realisation that it's possible this teenager could have been stopped from carrying out this horrific crime. But also he himself has come under attack from some political opponents about the possibility of covering up information. I think he wanted to get out there at the first opportunity after this case had concluded in order to get, you know, his views out there. But, you know, I do think there's a lot broader than that. As you say, it's about the nature of terrorism, it's about social media. You know, he talked about the repercussions of the pandemic as well. It's an awful lot to grapple with here, that's for sure.
Right, well, he's been accused of a cover-up over what he knew, what authorities knew about the details of the perpetrator. Let's just listen to his response, because he tackles this head-on.
If this trial had collapsed because I or anyone else had revealed crucial details while the police were investigating, while the case was being built, while we were awaiting a verdict, then the vile individual who committed these crimes would have walked away a free man.
Has he answered his critics, Vicki?
I think on that one, you know, there are very strict laws, contempt laws. Now, they apply to us as journalists as well as to everyone else about what you can report once someone has been charged with a crime. And what Sir Keir Starmer there is saying is that actually if the trial had collapsed because people had reported and said things that they shouldn't have done that could have been prejudicial, then people would, of course, have been rightly criticising him. But, you know, it is much broader than that. I think there's still questions about whether the police could have corrected some of the things that were circulating online before the riots, of course, took place. And that's a big part of what this public inquiry is going to be about as well. The nature of terrorism, looking at the Prevent organisation, what do you do about that? And, you know, Sir Keir Starmer was much broader than that, talking about people who now have parallel lives. What do you do about a teenager, a boy who is sitting in his room, he's becoming obsessed with violence. Lots of organisations knew about him. But no one acted enough to stop him doing this. And there's a big question there for society about how you tackle that.
Vicki Young, thank you very much. Harriet, do you accept what Keir Starmer has said in terms of not being able to reveal or talk about any of the details for risk of causing a trial to collapse, for contempt of court?
And obviously the trial collapsing would be the last thing that anyone wanted. But there is a balance. And yes, you cannot say everything, but there is certainly more that could have been said. And indeed, Jonathan Hall, KC, the independent counter-terrorist reviewer, he also said that more information could have been put out to allay some of the public concerns, some of the conspiracies which were being fed and fuelled. And that was, we can all accept that that was done at a level which was to bring more anger and discourse into the public debate as well, which was not helpful. No one who was rioting had a reason to riot. No one who was perpetuating the riots should have been doing that. But there was fear or concern within the public that there was not the information being given out which was needed, and also
what was that
not.
information? I mean, I've heard, Jonathan Hall, you're absolutely right, and I've heard what you've said, and the Shadow Justice Secretary, Robert Jenrick. But what was the information that could have come to light without risking the trial collapsing or fuelling any of the divisions that seem to spill out onto the streets?
Well, the first one which comes to my mind would be that the killer was British-born. He wasn't an immigrant. That was something that was being perpetuated and was then fueling sort of the immigration arguments. And that was when we saw, for example, targeting on immigration hotels, migrant hotels. There's other information which, again, it's once the fire gets set under something, it starts to snowball and snowball and snowball. So it's where you actually start to catch it. But we're not saying give away information which would have in any way impacted the trial. That's not what's needed. But you need something in order to just stop these things snowballing where possible.
I mean, do you agree with that there could have been more that could have been said about it? Jonathan Hall, I mean, Harriet's right, said there was more the government could have put in the public domain without collapsing a trial.
But these are always difficult decisions, and it's always a hard balancing act. And maybe you don't always get it perfect. But let me put it this way. When you're making those difficult decisions, when you're dealing with those trade-offs, I would far rather a government whose top priority was ensuring that they didn't collapse a case that yesterday meant a man was found guilty of a crime and is now going to face a jail sentence as a consequence of it. I would far rather they went slightly further to ensure that he went to prison than putting information into the public domain that seriously risked, that not coming out and that not happening.
Do you think Robert Jenrick's been responsible in terms of raising the idea of a cover-up? He says that questions left unanswered, the sense of a cover-up will permanently damage trust in the criminal justice system. Is that responsible?
I think, as it comes back to, it's making sure that the public have enough information to account for fears that they have, whereas not sort of feeding more information than is needed, which will prejudice the trial. We need to make sure that the public understand what's happening, also understand that there's so much that can be said, but not leave them with a void that then gets filled with conspiracies or other theories which then help perpetuate riots, etc.
Do you think it was helpful that the former Conservative MP, Sir Jake Berry, yesterday tweeted insinuating that Keir Starmer had put the trial yesterday on the same day as the Trump inauguration so that it would be concealed from the public view?
Yes, and I've heard a lot of people saying that, and no, it wasn't helpful. I mean, Sir Keir Starmer does not dictate when the trial is. So, no, it was not a helpful thing to say, and it doesn't help with these sort of conspiracy theories.
I mean, you work for a man, Nigel Farage, who was also one of those who said that there has been a cover-up, or has accused Keir Starmer of being a cover-up. But listening to what you heard the Prime Minister say, that was wrong.
Well, he would say that, wouldn't he? I mean, have you had a cover-up? No, I haven't had a cover-up.
No, but in terms of the justification for not coming forward with the details.
Well, I don't necessarily follow that. One specific example as why, in almost any other case I have seen, and by the way, I don't recall a single case that's dropped because of sub judice. I don't remember any case being fallen apart because we were told the information straight after the attack.
So you're saying it is worth risking it, though?
I think, well, in the case of when Jo Cox was murdered, we found out, we were told it was terrorist that day. And then the specific case I'm thinking about is in this. We were given a photograph of an angelic schoolboy. I don't recall a case where the photograph of the perpetrator, the police photograph, was not put out initially. Why? We only saw that yesterday. How come? So that's one thing. And at the same time, there was, I can't remember his name, with a ghastly right-wing fellow who stabbed somebody. His photograph went up straight away. Blonde hair, blue eyes, and his photograph was announced and put out. So what's the difference between this murderer and that right-wing bigot? And what is the motivation?
Chris?
Look, Jo, you and everybody else in this building will have to deal with decisions like this every single day. You know how difficult these decisions are. So does the Prime Minister, so does everyone across government. I think, and as Vicki said beforehand, he gave a pretty good account of why he made the decisions that he made. And as I said, I think he's right that the top priority should be ensuring that case went forwards as it did.
But people like Wayne Taylor are not convinced or reassured by it. So, I mean, in that...
Lord Carlisle also it was key in defining what terrorism is and all the rest of it. What he said, there should have been more
information. We'll come on to the definition of a new legal framework in just a moment.
We can spend this entire show talking about exactly what information should have been put out when, and I don't think it would get us very far. And I tell you why, because what today should be about is 3 girls who should be in school today who are not in school because they had their lives taken away from them. Yep. And it's ensuring that this government puts in place that inquiry and the various measures, law changes that if necessary, in order to minimise the chance that something like this ever happens again. Well, that's what this government is rightly focusing on.
Well, let's hear a little bit more from Keir Starmer, because he does talk more broadly about a societal threat. Does the legal framework need to change following this case? Let's have a listen.
Terrorism has changed. In the past, the predominant threat was highly organised groups with clear political intent, groups like Al-Qaeda. That threat, of course, remains. But now, alongside that, we also see acts of extreme violence perpetrated by loners, misfits, young men in their bedroom, accessing all manner of material online, desperate for notoriety.
Do we need new laws, Ava? Do we need to change the legal framework for judging this type of case?
What, for prevent? Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
let me just say what prevent is, because this is the strategy that is supposed to counter terrorist threats.
Yeah, and so look, listening to Keir Starmer, then I don't want to sort of critique for critique's sake, but it does feel frustrating to hear him speak in that manner, because it really does show a lack of haste and a lack of not catching up. I mean, he's talking about Al-Qaeda. I mean, it's not 2005, is it? You know, we've got an entirely different threat of terrorism, threats that we've known about now for the past decade. A lone wolf attack we've known about for a considerable amount of time. We've known about the threat of far-right terror. And actually, one thing that he did speak about, which was very interesting, was accessing information online and how people are able to go into their bedrooms and within 2 clicks, they can see extremely violent content. And the framework, the legal framework for referring these people is simply not there. I mean, Prevent talks about people going to, you know, their local place of worship and being radicalised by people like, you know, by the local faith leader. I mean, we don't have, you know, working man's clubs anymore. People aren't going outside to meet and chat about these things. They're in their bedroom. And the bigger problem, the overarching problem you've got, is companies like Meta, companies like X, who all of these, whatever you do on there, it's encrypted and they rarely hand over the correct information to authorities.
Right. So what you know, is the Prime Minister behind the curve on this? We have known about lone wolf, you know, cases. There have been a number of them. What is different?
So I don't think it's a case of the Prime Minister being behind the curve, but I certainly think the governing structures that we have in this country generally are behind the curve. That's why it's important that we're going forward with this public inquiry that is going to look at all of this. But I should say this as well, because it is important, just to address Alva's point. If we need to make changes, including changing the law, in the meantime, we will certainly look at doing so. Right.
I mean, Gwen, what is it that can change that would have identified this young man, because he was known to various authorities, and would have prevented him to go on and kill those girls?
I think at each point in the Prevent process, from what I've read, they said, oh, well, he doesn't have a defining ideology. It's nothing serious. Let's not talk about it. He doesn't have an... He was looking at things...
Well, it may have been serious, but it wasn't terrorism.
They said the framework wasn't there to prosecute him because of what he was accessing.
Whereas I remember a 13-year-old boy in his school in Southampton back in 2014 being taken, and his father being interviewed by the police and him being interviewed by the police for looking up UKIP by Prevent. So there's something... obviously, that's a defining ideology.
Broken. I mean, the whole thing should be thrown out.
But that was back in 2014. We knew it was broken then, and I agree with Ava. We have the idea that Keir Starmer is saying there's this new form of terrorism, the lone wolf. There were lone wolves in the 1860s. This has been part of terrorism. You have the Al-Qaeda style, you have the ISIS style, you have the hard right style, you have all that where you've got groups and cells. But you also have had lone wolves who are ticked by... flipped by an ideology that acts entirely on their own because they know that killing people is good for their cause. The fellow who drove through a market in Germany, he was a lone wolf. They're all lone wolves until we find otherwise.
So what is the solution? How do you pick up these violence-obsessed individuals? What is the legal framework that can possibly deal with that?
Prevent, as everyone has said, Prevent is has its limitations. It's very much focused on the threat of right-wing and sort of the Muslim ideologies.
Extremists.
And it's the stuff in the middle that's being missed. I'd like to see more on actually what society and families can do. If a lot of this is happening in the home, surely that's an obligation on families to actually start asking questions and noticing, because you notice changes at home first.
But the father of this killer did refer him. He begged twice with taxi drivers not to take him to certain locations. I don't think that he is solely responsible in this scenario. You know, what is he actually meant to do if there's not a larger, you know, if there's not a police force that can prosecute this person? What's he meant to do?
The only person responsible is the person who carried out the crime. He's the person responsible. But there is areas around there where people can fall through nets or where things should be picked up. Indeed, the father had noticed things, did speak to things, but there therefore needs to be a structure in which there can be a proper reporting mechanism and it's taken seriously.
But it was reported.
And that's therefore
the prevent scheme is the problem, because nothing was done after it was reported.
And I think we're saying the same thing. It needs to be that these things are actually, because it didn't fall into one of the two nets which Prevent normally looks at, it needs to be better at actually picking up other types of extremism, other types of threat, other types of ideologies which aren't sort of in the two mechanisms which Prevent seem to sort of focus on most.
One thing Starma did say that I hope we can believe, and sadly I don't trust him, but let's say it's true. He said when they were going to do the looking into it, no culture, no society is out of the question.
No, he said everything is on the table.
Yeah, everything's on the table, including cultural assumptions.
Sensitivities was the word he used.
Nobody is protected from this.
Right.
And I really hope that he means that. I doubt it because of what's been said about the rape gang scandal and not having investigations there, and for why and the motives. But I hope he is right, and I hope he sticks to that.
Well, Chris, how do you respond to that? Because he did make that part of the speech saying that there will not be cultural sensitivities around that, implying that there has been a problem in the past.
I think he does mean it. I
hope he does.
I think it's really important as well that what we're talking about here, I'm going to bring it back again, is 3 girls who lost their lives and ensuring the safety of everybody across this country. So no, that needs to be the priority above anything else, including cultural sensitivities, and I think the Prime Minister made that pretty clear this morning.
But we're going to... Oh, well, finally, but then we're going to move on.
I was just going to say, even if you do manage to prosecute someone, what maximum security, you know, prison can you actually put them in? Because that's another issue on top of this. There's actually no facility for these people to go to.
Well, that might be a discussion for another day. We're going to move on because, of course, it was the inauguration of Donald Trump in his second term as US President. Let's have a look at a couple of the front pages. The Times. The golden age starts now. Donald Trump with Melania. It's the same headline in the Financial Times. The golden age of America begins now. And in The Guardian, referring to what Donald Trump said yesterday in his inaugural address, I was saved by God to make America great again, referring to the assassination attempt. Well, let's just hear a little bit of the speech referring to this golden age.
The golden age of America begins right now. I return to the presidency confident and optimistic that we are at the start of a thrilling new era of national success. A tide of change is sweeping the country, sunlight is pouring over the entire world, and America has the chance to seize this opportunity like never before.
Gwaine, is his optimism justified?
I think as people from this side of their pond, we look at this sort of speech with jaws open, because we just can't imagine any politician ever being so optimistic, so positive, so go-getting, so forcefully so. And to me, it's remarkable. And we all sit there going, I can't believe he said that, because we are so tired and old world and cynical.
But is it justified? The
I suspect
optimism?
it might be. We will no doubt find out over the next 4 years, but I suspect it might be. They certainly believe it. And you never succeed without having ambition, and by gum, that shows ambition. I'm considering changing my pronouns to golden and age. I think it would be that positivity is in itself electrifying.
Right. Do you think that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves could perhaps embrace a bit more optimism and that sort of upbeat tone, Chris?
Well, I think there's, in many ways, there's optimism in what they say, but more importantly, politics is not about just talking about a brighter future, but working to achieve a brighter future, and I think that's a lot of what this government's doing. In terms of the question you asked,
yes, is it justified?
I hope it's justified. I hope it's justified because we're an interconnected world. This isn't a zero-sum game. A successful America, a successful international economy is good for us here at home, and we'll continue to work with all of our allies around the world to ensure we protect the best interests of the United Kingdom.
Sunlight is pouring over the entire world, Ava. Is his optimism justified?
Possibly for him, if he closes all the borders and they're only manufacturing within inside the US, that might be helpful for their economy. But I mean, also we're talking about this in broad strokes. He was very denigrating about the previous 4 or 5 years, and actually he was rather downbeat at points in that speech, and he was rather frustrated. We also had the most insane display from one of his advisors, Elon Musk. I mean, some of the things that he said, I'm sure we're going to get onto this, but some of the things that Trump was talking about yesterday really did raise an eyebrow from me. I mean, when he was talking about the people who've been imprisoned after the insurrection, he was describing them as hostages. Bearing in mind, this is 2 days after the actual hostages were released. And then you have Elon Musk replicating what seemed to be a Nazi signal on live television behind the president's podium. I thought it was a shocking display.
Right, well, let's have a look at it because, as you say, Elon Musk, richest man in the world, he'll serve in Donald Trump's administration. Let's have a look to what Ava is referring to. Keep an eye on what Elon Musk does at the end of the clip.
This one really mattered. And I just want to say thank you for making it happen. Thank you. My heart goes out to you.
Well, Ava, you're convinced that was a Nazi salute. What do you think, Wayne?
I think it's more to do with his sci-fi tech bro space to Mars, fly to Mars thing. I think it's much more to do with that sort of thing. I do not believe it's a Nazi.
Don't you love that we've been told for the past 5-6 years that the thing we need to be most frightened of is what pronouns people are using, and then someone actually does a Nazi salute behind the president's podium on live television, and we're fine with that.
I've spent many years talking to people saying, don't wave, don't do things of this sort, make sure your arm doesn't move there. We've seen dozens of photographs over the last 2 days as people respond to this of virtually every single politician in the world having been photographed looking like they've done a Nazi salute. I do not believe that's
I think it might be plausible deniability. I think, Musk is very good. Musk is very good at grabbing the attention economy, and I think in this scenario he knows that his supporters will defend him and say he didn't know what it was, and all of the quote-unquote libs, as they like to call them, will be enraged by this and upset by proceedings.
Figured, I guess.
But, either way, the clip will go viral and he grabs the attention economy.
Does he know what he's doing there?
Honestly, I couldn't presume to see inside that head. I really wouldn't. It's an extraordinary place. Does amazing things. There's excitement about the idea of going to Mars. I couldn't presume to see inside a head that is that brilliant, but that different to mine.
What did you think when you saw that, Chris?
I think Elon Musk wants us to be talking about whether he did a Nazi salute or not, and therefore the best thing for me to do is to not spend any time talking about whether Elon Musk did a Nazi salute. All
right, well, let's go back to the optimism, because Chris was talking about, I hope America is successful, because that will mean the rest of the world is successful. But what about the issue of tariffs? Because he called it previously a beautiful word, and he did talk about the billions of dollars that he is expecting to come into the country to enrich America. He says massive amounts of money pouring into our treasury coming from foreign sources. How does that make you feel?
Well, I think plus businesses across the UK will not welcome tariffs on our goods. It's not anything that we'll be looking for, which is why it's more important than ever that we are working towards a free trade agreement with America, making sure that our businesses are protected, that our export market to the US, one of the biggest markets in the world, is strong and robust. And the best way we can do that is ensuring that Trump sees us as a strong ally, as a company that he can do business with, something that offers him opportunity that he can then expand his optimism into, while at the same time making sure that our priorities and our key objectives are kept intact with that. An important way to make sure that we get a good deal is to go in with a strong economy and robust policies. So it's up to us to make sure, and it's up to the Labour government to make sure that we have a strong hand going into any free trade agreement.
Well, maybe this will help. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, is in Davos at the World Economic Forum to pitch growth plan to elites in Davos. The Chancellor hopes that a series of meetings held behind closed doors, including with allies of President Trump, can help build confidence in Britain. You're laughing. Why?
I am. I'm sorry. Look, I agree with Chris. A successful America is good for us, most likely. I also think that one has to remember, America voted for Donald Trump to be a politician that focuses on the interests of America above everybody else. The fact that Rachel Reeves has gone to Davos makes a strong suggestion that she's focusing on the interests of everybody else before the people of this country.
Why does
time and time again. Because Keir Starmer was asked Westminster or Davos, and he famously said Davos. We feel the people of this country generally, a large numbers of, not all, of course, but many of them feel that this government is more interested in looking good abroad than looking good and working.
Well, let Chris respond.
That's how people feel.
Look, I mean, if we accept the premise of the argument that you just accepted, which is strong US economy is good for the UK. We accept the argument, and I assume everybody on this does, that we live in a pretty complex and difficult and interconnected world. What happens everywhere else in the world affects us here at home. What happens here at home affects everywhere else in the world. I think it's important in that context to make sure that we are, we talked about why we need to ensure that tariffs aren't put in place, because free movement of goods from the UK to the US and many other countries around the world is really good and positive for British businesses. We live in an interconnected world. It's important in that kind of world that we talk to each other, and I'm pretty happy that we've got a Prime Minister and a Chancellor that ensures that we talk to people from right across this planet in the best interests of people here in the United Kingdom.
Is it going to protect the UK from possible tariffs from the US administration, doing things like going to Davos, trying to get the growth that the government's looking for?
I mean, if we closer align ourselves with the EU, then perhaps we might be more attractive to someone like the US in order to do a deal. I would also add, I think that if we had a reform government, hypothetically, I'm pretty sure that Chancellor or Farage himself would be travelling over to Davos to have these conversations.
He's not in the UK at the moment, is he? Unless he got back this morning. He was in another country. So why is it great for Farage to be in another country?
Farage doesn't represent the government of this country, the taxation rates of this country, the trade deals of this country. He doesn't. So what? Much as I'd like him to, he doesn't.
He's over in the US for the best interests of Clacton? For what's the argument for why he's...
Well, he thinks it is in the best interest of the country, absolutely.
Exactly. Because,
and it's for fun.
Because what's in the best interests of this country is to speak to people from around the world, and that's exactly what the Prime Minister and the Chancellor has been doing.
Well, let Harriet speak.
I think we need to consider what deals or what opportunities or growth Rachel Reeves is expecting to get from Davos, and what actually is she going to be selling insofar as opportunities in the UK to invest into. Yeah. It's not as if we've got an economy which is booming at the moment, or that we're giving businesses a huge opportunity in terms of new taxation, NICs, or the Employment Right Bill, which is going to put huge amounts of pressure and expense on businesses. What are we actually asking people to invest in the UK?
Well, here's one idea, and you're chair of the growth group, lucky old you, Chris, in The Independent, Rachel Reeves to back Heathrow third runway in bid for economic growth. Would you back that idea for growth?
Well, can I just say on that point first? I will answer your question. I will say on that point first, recent survey shows the UK was the second best country in the world to invest in. We want to get that to the top of the list. It is certainly true that we've inherited an economy that wasn't working. We are determined to do everything to do... That's rubbish and you know it. We are determined to do everything that we can in order to get it fixed. And in my view, that does include building a third runway at Heathrow. We talked about the importance of living in an interconnected world. I think having more airport capacity, including at Heathrow, is a really important part of that.
So you'd like to hear the Chancellor formally announce her approval for that third runway?
I would, yes.
Right. Are you expecting that shortly?
That's information that's kept from me, I'm afraid to say, but I would...
Well, even as chair of the growth group?
I would certainly welcome such an announcement if the Chancellor does go forwards to make it.
What difference do you think it would make, growth-wise?
Well, so it's not just about a singular project. It's about a wide range of projects that the government needs to do in order to unlock investment in the United Kingdom, and I think Heathrow is a very important part of that.
Just briefly, how would it fit with the government's target, net zero targets for 2030 and beyond?
Well, there's lots of other things that I'm sure you're aware this government is doing on sustainability. But look, we talk about the things that this country is good at. One of the things that Britain is world leading at is sustainable aviation fuels, and we are going to be the country that works towards making flying sustainable and greener going forwards into the future. And we can also redouble our efforts to continue being a world leader in such an important space.
Well, let's talk briefly about the political impact of Donald Trump's second term of office. The Daily Telegraph has this headline from Nigel Farage: "I could be Prime Minister before Trump leaves office." This is in response or reporting an interview that Nigel Farage, the leader of Reform UK, gave to Channel 5 News, saying he did genuinely believe he could be the next Prime Minister, and said it's possible. I wouldn't put it at more than 20-25%, but it's possible. Do you think it's possible?
If you asked me 6 months ago, I'd have probably said no. But now I don't. I think it is possible. I don't think it's likely. 20-25%, I think, suggests it's not likely. But do I think if the current trajectories continue when it comes to the polling, let's see how the results in the elections next year and the following year go. It's very, very early days. But is it out of the question? Absolutely not. I think that there's a good chance of Reform being the largest single party at the next election, either in votes cast or in seats won. I don't think it's likely, but it's certainly not out of the question.
Ava?
I think there'll certainly be an opposition. I've been travelling around the country, and it is very interesting to see how many young people are organising in areas in a way that I actually haven't seen since I was covering the Corbyn years. The way that support is growing. Tuesday nights, Wednesday nights, people are gathering and they are discussing reform, and they are pushing for it. Also, you've got to remember, in America, it was social media, arguably, that really pushed the Donald Trump vote. Things like the Joe Rogan podcast, things like Andrew Tate, actually not so much Andrew Tate, that's not quite fair, but Joe Rogan, that sort of making politics quite masculine and fun and available on social media. That's what Reform do. Right.
Does that send shivers down your spine, the idea that Reform UK could be the opposition?
I think could is doing a lot of heavy lifting, as in the same headline as Farage could be PM. I mean, we need to actually put this back into sort of reality and what's being offered. At the moment, Reform seem to be the none of the above party. They say what they're against all the time. It's very easy to be against something. It's very easy to be against everything. But what actually is the offer? How are they going to...
Isn't that what you guys are at the moment, though? Because with all due respect, whenever I'm watching the Commons at the moment, every single time the Shadow Minister gets up to give a statement, it very much is, you haven't done this, you haven't done that. And to be honest, it's kind of, you know, your record that has caused most of the problems that the Labour ministers are trying to battle.
Where we are at the moment, we had a huge election defeat. We don't shy away from that. We recognise that, and we understand that the country told us that we needed to change. We accept that 100%. Can you change overnight? You can. Is it going to be lasting? Probably not. It has to be a process that you go on.
I don't think you have any policies at the moment, which is the critique that you're offering to Reform. Like, if you ask me right now, what does Kemi Badenoch want to do if she was in government tomorrow? I don't know if I'd be able to tell you outside of maybe she'd like to ban pronouns.
Well, has she got the time, Kemi Badenoch, to set out her policies? Or...
Of course she has the time.
OK.
There's not going to be an election until, I mean,
probably
assuming...
until Trump's out of office.
There we go.
That is the most likely, yes. But it's not just they don't have policies. One of the things I've had over the last year, I've asked questions of Conservatives, be they Spads, be they this ministers, what are you for? It's not... People know what Reform are for. They don't know what the Conservatives are for anymore. In fact, most Conservatives don't know what Conservatives are for.
Well,
their supporters do, but they chime with what Reform
Well, one might argue that's what oppositions do, but I shall leave that to lie there. President Trump could come up tomorrow at Prime Minister's Questions. Keir Starmer will face Kemi Badenoch at noon, but we'll be on air at the earlier time of 11:15 to bring you all the build-up and reaction to that, so do join me then. Let's talk about another legacy issue, you might call it. Let's have a look at this headline in the Daily Telegraph. Benefits bill to be cut in ruthless crackdown on wasteful spending. To give you a bit of context, it's looking ahead to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Darren Jones, who's making a speech this afternoon. He is talking about the spending review, but a reckoning on wasteful public spending. What do you want to hear from Darren Jones this afternoon? Do you want to hear him talk about urgent reform on benefits?
I want to hear a wide range of measures that are going to be necessary in order to get down the unbelievably high number of people in the UK who are not in work, including in particular young people who have not been able to get into the workforce. We have failed the pandemic generation, and it is important that we start to put that right as quickly as possible. Look, some of this is about welfare reform. Ultimately, in many cases, the system is set up in a way that makes it more difficult and puts barriers in the way of people moving into the workforce, including in the way the incentives work. We also need to think about skills and the changes that we're making to skills policy to make it easier for people to get the skills they need to get into jobs, but also make it easier for people to reskill later in life. But probably the most important thing we also need to look at is healthcare. There are too many people that are out of work because they're sick, and that extra money that we're putting into the NHS because of the difficult decisions that we made in the budget is going to help us make sure that we can get more people healthy again.
Yeah, but is that the right diagnosis, to coin a phrase? Because the Lords Economic Affairs Committee has looked into the welfare system and benefits, and they say there's no convincing evidence that waiting lists, NHS waiting lists, are the main driver of increased benefit claims. What do you say to that? Has Labour come to the wrong conclusion?
I'd say, look, the fact that there's no evidence for something is not evidence that it's not true. And I think most of us can see from everyday lives, from our constituencies, from the people that we speak to, from those long NHS waiting lists, that it is ultimately one of the key reasons. But you're right to say that it's not the only reason. And that's why, as I answered your question with originally, it's important that Darren talks about the range of things that this country needs to do in order to get down.
Right, but what they say is the problem is a structural problem with the welfare system.
Yep.
So do you accept that that should be the priority in terms of reforming the system rather than waiting lists? I mean, you can do both, but that is the main driver for people in terms of benefits.
Well, I gave you a list of 3 things, and that was top of it. It's certainly one of the things that this government needs to look at. But we need to look across the board at how we can ensure that the state works to get down the number of people who are out of work.
I mean, and that number climbed when Conservatives were in office over a number of years leading up to the pandemic and beyond. Do you admit that it is a failure of your party to get a grip of this?
Certainly the number of people claiming out of work benefit, welfare payments has increased. There are multiple reasons for that. We set out going into the election quite a robust plan on how to reform the welfare system. It was expected to save, I think it was about £5 billion out of the welfare system if those had been implemented. And there were things like improved mental health support, moving sick note or fit to work notes away from GPs into more occupational sort of side things to see actually how people can work around work, ensuring that sort of if you can work part-time or reduced hours alongside an illness, because obviously it's good for businesses, it's also good for individuals. But what's actually concerning is how long it's taking for this consultation that Labour are bringing forward to actually come. So we're almost 7 months now since the election, and we're told that this consultation is not going to be till the spring, and the spring is probably quite a loose time scale, I'd say. Every month we're seeing £250 million more being spent on it as and when people are being added on. So this does need to be brought forward sooner rather than later, and it is concerning that it is seemingly being put into the long grass.
Wayne?
I feel it was a 98% increase in the number of people taking disability benefits in the last 3 years. That's astonishing. And I almost feel...
I don't know if it's 98%, I don't know, but it's certainly an increase.
It's a doubling of the number of people. Now, I do not believe twice as many people are sick now as they were 3 years ago. I just don't believe it. So I feel that when you talk about structural, what it has become, it has been an easy way of almost getting people off the unemployment thing. So if you take the disability benefits, then you don't have to be included in these statistics and those statistics. So the structural thing is, are we encouraging people to take advantage of disability benefits in order that we can shift them off the responsibility aspect?
I don't know, though. I think the natural progression is we've had the pandemic. A lot of people are waiting for mental health treatment, and so they are signed off work, and so they are on these benefits. And the big missing cog in that chain is that there simply isn't the mental health provision. But I would also add, I do think all of this is a ginormous waste of time. This sort of getting people back, off of benefits and into work, ginormous waste of time when you could be taxing the wealthy, because the number of people that you need,
you would leave the system untouched.
Thousands of people in DWP you have to hire to crack down on these so-called...
Taxing the wealthy is driving the entrepreneurs out of this country.
Let me just finish.
By their hundreds.
You have to hire thousands of people in to do this, and you actually get nothing back. By the time you spend all of that money on hiring people, you actually get nothing back in the exchequer.
Chris, you've only got a few seconds, but go on.
Can I just both of those points very quickly? On that one, we need to get people into work because we live in a better country. It's about that more than it's about money. And on your point as well, I think on the structural point, there are going to have to be people in Britain who are maybe sicker who have some level of disability, some level of illness, who are going to have to work. And it's important we accept that as a country, and we also work with employers to make sure that they can accommodate those people as well. And that's the kind of structural changes that were talked about in that review that we need to work towards implementing.
It's all we have time for today. Thank you to all of my guests for joining me. I will be back, as I said earlier, tomorrow at 11:15 for Prime Minister's Questions. Bye-bye.